Welcome to PM in the PM. This is my regular podcast where I take a recent event or a topical event and look at how it links to the ACCA Performance Management syllabus. One thing that has happened where I live in the last few days is the sun has come out and it's really nice going out for a nice walk around. I live by the coast, so I walk along the beach. And one thing that changes quite clearly when it's sunny is there are more places selling ice creams. Now, ice creams are one of the classic examples that we see and we use when we're looking at the topic of risk when we're doing performance management. So the sun's out, you walk past an ice cream van, there's a queue forming, there's kids everywhere excited about getting an ice cream. And here's the question, how many ice creams should that seller have put on their van that day? If they put too many on, if they put more on their van than they're going to sell, then maybe for health and safety reasons they have to get rid of them because they can't use them the next day. They go to waste. So they have too many, they don't sell them all, and some go to waste. But if they have too few and they run out, then they lose on potential profit. And this is a PM decision-making scenario. Now, before we go any further, before we look at our ice cream van, it's worth just touching on the distinction between risk and uncertainty. In everyday life, we often use those terms interchangeably, but in PM they have different definitions. In both risk and uncertainty, what we're looking at is some future event that may or may not happen. And with risk, we normally have historical data that gives us the probability of that event occurring. Whereas with uncertainty, we don't have that. We don't have that data that gives us an idea of the likelihood of a particular outcome. And that's true with someone selling ice creams. They don't know for a fact what the weather is going to be like on a particular day. Although I've had a few days of sunshine near where I live, tomorrow it could be raining. And that ice cream seller will not know definitely whether it's going to rain tomorrow. What they could do though is they could look at all of the weather data for April in this area, going back maybe 15 years, and they could get an idea that on April it's sunny on 30% of the days, rainy on 40%, and overcast but not rainy on the rest. And then as they move later into the year, into June and July, the percentage of sunny days will increase and the percentage of rainy and overcast days will decrease. And we have tools that we learn about in PM, some that we apply to the situation of risk where we've got that probability, and some we apply to uncertainty, decisions under uncertainty, where we don't have or we're not using that information. So back to our scenario, we've got our ice cream seller. They need to decide how many ice creams they put on their van. They either are going to sell them or they're going to have to throw them away because of health and safety reasons if they're not sold at the end of the day. Maybe they could stock 100 ice creams or 200 or 300. And we know demand is going to depend on the weather. If it's sunny, demand will be high. If it's rainy, demand will be low. If it's overcast, then demand will be somewhere in the middle. And a podcast is obviously not the place to go into a complex in-depth calculation, so I'll keep it simple. If it's the case that they decide to stock 100 ice creams, the worst case scenario, which would be when it's rainy, is that they make $100. But the best case scenario, if it was sunny, is they'd make $300. But if instead they were to stock 300 ice creams, the worst case now is they would lose $100, but the best case is they'd make $800. And in the middle, if they chose to stock 200, the worst case is they'd make $50, and the best case is they'd make $500. And using the tools of Maximax and Maximin, which we apply in periods of uncertainty where we don't have probabilities, these help this ice cream decision maker deal with uncertainty. If they are an optimistic ice cream seller, perhaps there's been a few sunny days like there has been now, so they maybe think, well, it's more likely to be sunny, and they would use a Maximax decision rule, and that means they would make that $800 if it was sunny, only if it was sunny. And how do they go through that process? Well, they look at the best outcome of each of the scenarios, which was if they stocked 100 ice creams, they'd make $300. If they stock 200 ice creams, they'd make $500. And if they stock 300 ice creams, they'd make $800. And so they would go, well, it was been sunny the last 3 days. I'm very optimistic. It's going to be sunny tomorrow. So I'm going to stock 300 and hope I can make $800. Doesn't mean they will, because it could rain tomorrow. And we know if it rains, what they'll actually do is lose $100. But they still take that risk. It's that risk seeker mindset, because they're hoping for that big reward. They're hoping for that $800 profit on a sunny day. But let's flip it around. Let's say they are risk averse. So maybe they've done this before and then they've overstocked and they've lost money. So they've changed their view and now they just want to have that reassurance. They know that they will at least make a certain amount. And they would use the Maximin decision rule. What they would do is they would look at what's the worst that could happen. If I stock 100 ice creams, what's the worst position I can be in? If I stock 200, if I stock 300, what's the worst I could be in? And so using our scenario, if they stock 100, the worst position they could be in is to make $100. If they stock 200, the worst position is they would make just $50. And if they were to stock 300 ice creams, the worst position would be they would lose $100. So what do? Out of those 3 worst case scenarios, the best one is to make $100. So they stock 100 ice creams and they know that no matter what, they will make $100. If it's raining, they'll make $100. And they're basically protecting themselves. It gives them that reassurance that they cannot do worse than $100. But what they give up is they give up that opportunity of making the higher profits, the $800 that the risk seeker type mindset went for. Now, Minimax regret is the other main decision rule that we have when we're looking at uncertainty. And it's often worth thinking of this as looking back after the event. At the end of the day, they're packing up. They've sold out. They regret maybe that they've missed out on some profits. If they're having to throw some ice creams away, their regret is that they're seeing their profits disappear because they're chucking away stock. And what Minimax regret aims to do is to find out what is the biggest regret that they would have for each decision they could make. And we look at that from the financial aspect. And so we compare the best case scenario on each type of day. So we take a sunny day, what would have been the best decision to have made, and then compare that to each of the other decisions and see the difference. And then we do the same for the overcast day, and then we do the same for the rainy day. And for each of those 3 days, sunny, overcast or rainy, we look to see what is the biggest value of that regret, the biggest financial impact. And then we choose the minimum, the lowest of those, the least amount of regret. I can't really go through building a regret table on a podcast, but if you were to do it with this scenario, that would point back to 300 ice creams. 300 ice creams is the amount you would stock to have the best value of Minimax regret. So you would choose to stock 300 ice creams. Now let's bring in expected value. Expected value is a decision-making tool that deals with risk, and it's where we do have probabilities, and we can use those probabilities to give us a good indication of what might happen based on what has happened in the past. And so they need some probabilities. What they do is they look at past data, and maybe for a particular month they find out there's 20% chance of rain, 30% chance of it being cloudy, 50% chance of it being sunny. And because they are going out selling ice creams every day, and that's a really important thing to remember for using expected value, it's used when we are dealing with repeated decisions. If they were just doing a single festival, they wouldn't use expected value because they aren't going to keep doing that festival again and again. However, if they're setting up their ice cream van on a beachfront, then expected value will take into account all those times when they do well, all those times when they do less well, balance them out and give them a decision tool that helps them do the best over time. So using those percentages, what we do in the calculation is we take the percentage of each outcome and we multiply that by the profit, and then we add them all together to get this weighted average. We do that calculation for each decision they could make. So we work out if they stocked 100 ice creams, what would that weighted average be? If they stocked 200, what would that weighted average be? And if they stocked 300, what would that weighted average be? And again, I won't do the calculation here, but the figures are for 100 ice creams is $230, for 200 ice creams is $335, and for 300 ice creams is $440. So what decision would you make? You would choose to stock 300 ice creams. That doesn't mean they will make $440 on a particular day. What they will make will depend on what the weather's like. If the weather's good, they'll make more than $440. If the weather's bad, if it's rainy, we know they'll lose money. But over time, because they're doing it again and again, that will average out. So they will, on average, make $440 a day. But it does require us to have those probabilities of those different weather outcomes. Now, just because we know those percentages of rain, overcast, sunshine in the past, doesn't mean that's what's going to happen in the future. So there's a weakness in using EV because it assumes that the past is a predictor of the future. And then the other thing that you can get tested on is the value of perfect information and the value of imperfect information. And what we do is we take that expected value, and the decision they made then was to stock 300 ice creams, and we know that the value of that was $440. We would redo a calculation knowing what the weather looks like. And what that would mean is 20% of the time they would choose to only stock 100 because they know 20% chance it will rain. Because they've got perfect information, they know when it's going to rain. On those days, they would only stock 100 ice creams. On 30% of occasions, they would know it's going to be cloudy, so they would stock the 200 ice creams on those days. And with perfect information, they would know 50% of the time it's going to be sunny, and on those days, they would stock 300 ice creams. And we can redo a calculation, and we compare that to expected value without perfect information. And the difference is how much they would be willing to pay for that additional information. But a more realistic scenario is imperfect information. It's much harder to do a calculation, and I'd be surprised if you're ever asked to do a calculation on imperfect information, but you could be asked to understand what that means. So for example, perhaps there is an app that this person could buy that gives them a premium weather forecast. So instead of just blindly using those likelihoods of 20%, 30% and 50%, the app gives them a stronger indication of what the weather is going to be like, and then they could stock the appropriate number of ice creams. It won't be right, it won't be correct all the time, but because it's correct more often than just using that probability approach, they will make more profit. And if that app was relatively cheap, it would probably be a no-brainer for them to use it. But if it was $4,000 or $5,000 or $6,000, then maybe they wouldn't justify using it. So just a few final take-home tips when you are answering risk and uncertainty questions like this. Make sure you are clear on whether you have been asked what decision the decision maker would be making, which in this case is how many ice creams they will put on the van. Make sure you're differentiating that from the risk profile of that decision maker. Are they a risk seeker? Are they risk neutral? Are they risk averse? The risk seeker using Maximax, the risk averse using Maximin or Minimax regret, and the one in the middle, the risk neutral, is more likely to use the expected value. And then also make sure you are clear what the outcome will be. So they make the decision. The outcome will be based on a combination of the decision they have made, how many they stock, and the weather on that day. They cannot control the weather. So in this scenario, although they control how many they stock, let's say it was 200, there are 3 outcomes that could occur, and we do not know what they will be until after the day has finished. So thanks for tuning into PM in the PM. If you happen to have an ice cream while you were listening to this, that's brilliant. Hopefully you've had a nice sunny day enjoying an ice cream, but also increasing your knowledge of risk and uncertainty. Until next time, this is Richard Guyver signing off.